down to central Dallas. He met with Roy Truly, the superintendent of the building, and was hired on the spot. Back in Irving, Frazier lived with his older sister, Leni Randall. A few houses down the street lived a woman named Ruth Payne. On October the 14th, both Randall and Payne had a cup of coffee at the house of a neighbor. Payne brought along a friend and Russian immigrant named Marina Oswald, the wife of Lee Oswald. Marina could barely speak any English and had been staying with Payne for a few weeks, partly due to her husband's unemployment.
The subject of Lee looking for work and that he hadn't found work for a week came up while we were having coffee. And Mrs. Randall mentioned that her younger brother, Wesley Frazier, thought they needed another person at the Texas School Book Depository where Wesley worked.
Payne and Marina returned home, spoke with Roy Truly over the phone, and secured a job interview on behalf of Lee Oswald. The following morning, he went down to the book depository and began his first day of work on October the 16th.
Everything seems fine so far.
So, an acquaintance with whom Oswald's wife was currently staying had a casual conversation with a neighbor. That neighbor happened to have a brother who recently got employed at the book depository. This prompted his wife to ask the acquaintance to call the superintendent of the building to inquire about any vacancies.
I told Mrs. Payne that to send Oswald down and I would talk to him, that I didn't have anything in mind for him of a permanent nature, but if he was suited, we could possibly use him for a brief time.
The position was not only temporary, but only existed due to a temporary shortage of staff.
It was the end of our fall rush. If it hadn't existed a week or 2 weeks longer, or if we had not been using some of our regular boys putting down this plywood floor, we would not have had any need for Lee Oswald at that time, which is a tragic thing for me to think about.
But it gets even more tragic because Oswald was not the only one to apply for a job.
I might have sent Oswald to work in a warehouse 2 blocks away. Oswald and another fellow reported for work on the same day, and I needed one of them for the depository building. I picked Oswald.
If Oswald was somehow entangled in a conspiracy, and the aim of that conspiracy was for him to become employed at the book depository, this roundabout sequence of events is a very strange way to go about it.
The aim of the conspiracy was for him to become employed. Okay.
Of events is a very strange way to go about it.
Okay, true, yeah, it makes sense. But isn't strange good though to build a strong alibi if it's like kind of far out and kind of crazy? I mean,
as the name implies, the Texas School Book Depository was in the business of selling books. For $1.25 an hour, Oswald's job was to prepare the books for shipping. He did so by filling out forms and transporting cartons of books between the upper floors and the first. The building had 3 elevators, 2 staircases, and was 7 stories tall. In the northwest corner, 1 stairway and 2 freight elevators provided access to all 7 floors. A small passenger elevator near the front entrance stopped at level 4, while stories 1 and 2 were connected by a second flight of stairs. Lacking a driver's license, Oswald relied on Wesley Frazier to carpool between Irving and Dallas every Friday evening and Monday morning. He spent workdays at a rooming house in Dallas while spending the weekends with his wife and daughters in Irving. But on Thursday morning, November the 21st, the day before the assassination, Oswald decided to deviate from this routine.
I was standing there on the first floor getting the orders in, and Lee said, "Could I ride home with you this afternoon?" And I said, "Sure, like I told you. You can go home with me anytime you want to. Like I say, anytime you want to go see your wife, that is all right with me." Lee had never gone home in the middle of the week before, so I asked him why, and he stated that he was going home to get some curtain rods for his apartment. I asked if he was going home on Friday as well, and he said no.
Frazier drove Oswald back to Irving, where he arrived unannounced at the household of Ruth Payne. Both Payne and Marina were surprised to see Oswald on a Thursday. They assumed he'd come to make amends with Marina due to an argument they had had a few days before.
Did your husband give any reason for coming home on Thursday?
He said that he was lonely because he hadn't come the preceding weekend and he wanted to make his peace with me.
Was anything said about curtain rods or his taking curtain rods to town the following day?
No, I didn't have any.
He didn't say anything like that.
No.
The next day, Oswald said goodbye to his wife and left the Payne residence about 7:15.
I mean, maybe I'm missing the point, but that just devil's advocate. You could say that he's doing that because he didn't want to tell the other guy that he had an argument and say that he's going back to fucking fix the argument or whatever the fuck, right? He just came up with this fucking
Top
rod
dresser in
thing.
the bedroom, he left behind his wedding ring. Oswald was next seen walking down the street by Lenny Randall, carrying a package. He was soon joined by Fraser, and the two of them took a seat in his car to begin their commute.
When you got in the car, did you say anything to Oswald, or did he say anything to you?
I noticed there was a package lying on the back seat. I didn't pay too much attention, and I said, "What's the package, Lee?" And he said, "Curtain rods." And I said, "Oh yes, you told me you were going to bring some today."
Not only was Oswald carrying a large package, but he'd forgotten to bring a lunch bag.
When he rode with me, I say he always brought lunch, except that one day on November 22nd. He didn't bring his lunch that day. Right when I got in the car, I asked him where was his lunch, and he said he was going to buy his lunch that day.
They arrived in Dallas a few minutes before 8 o'clock. Typically, they would walk together from the parking lot to the book depository.
They're observing
But on this particular Friday, Oswald grabbed his curtain rods and rushed ahead into the building. Working on the ground floor, in view of the rear entrance, was their colleague, Jack Doherty.
Did you see Oswald come to work that morning?
Yes, when he first came into the door.
Did he have anything in his hands or arms?
Well, not that I could see of.
Fraser and Doherty are the only two people known to have seen Oswald entering the building. Fraser says he was carrying a package. Doherty says he was not. Contradictions like this one will become a recurring theme throughout the rest of this video. We'll take a closer look at the missing curtain rods in a later chapter, but for now, let's stay with Oswald.
And maybe he put it to the side as soon as he got in to leave it there like it's nothing and pick it back later.
As the morning progressed, Oswald was seen working as normal. Roy Truly described him as an above-average worker who mostly kept himself. In fact, he was a bit of a mystery to his colleagues.
On the way back and forth between Irving and Dallas, did you talk very much to each other?
No, sir, not very much. He was one of these types that just didn't talk.
I was acquainted with Lee Oswald during the time he was employed at the book depository, but I never did get to know him well. He did not mix with the other employees and did not appear to want to make friends with me or any of the others.
Did you ever speak to Oswald?
Yes, sir.
Did he ever speak to you?
No, sir.
He never replied to you?
No, sir.
Would you say he was unfriendly?
Yes, sir, I would.
But there were exceptions to his reticence, and one of them occurred on this Friday morning. James Jarman was working on the ground floor when he observed Oswald staring at the window facing Elm Street.
Oswald was standing up in the window, and I went to the window also, and he asked me, what were people gathering around the corner for? And I told him that the president was supposed to pass in the morning, and he asked me did I know which way he was coming. And I told him, yes, he'll probably come down Main and turn on Houston and then back again on Elm. Then he said, oh, I see. And that was all.
What the fuck?
It's a
How does he know all that?
brief yet fascinating moment. It almost seems as though Oswald had no idea that Kennedy would pass by the book depository. This was indeed the case for some of his colleagues. Jarman himself had only been made aware of the fact shortly before he spoke with Oswald. There's no doubt that Oswald knew the president was coming to Dallas, but whether he knew the route of the motorcade is much more difficult to prove. The route of the
Wait,
motorcade
hold on, sorry,
had only...
sorry, just a small pause. So this random employee that isn't plotting anything knows about the route and shit like that, and the guy who's plotting this mega plan that has multiple steps doesn't know about it? How not?
of the motorcade is much more difficult to prove. The route of the motorcade had only been finalized a few days before the visit and hinged upon its destination. Kennedy was supposed to attend a banquet in Dallas, but no one could agree on a venue. It came down to two options: the Trade Mart northwest of downtown or the Women's Building to the east. One of the more vocal proponents of the Trade Mart was Texas Governor John Connally, and after much back and forth, he finally got his way on November the 14th. Had the women's building been selected, the motorcade would have sped through Dealey Plaza, east on Main Street, significantly further away and perpendicular to the book depository. Not to mention that First Lady Jacqueline would have been seated between the building and the president. The selection of the Trade Mart meant that the motorcade would now head west on Main Street and make these turns through Dealey Plaza to reach the northbound lanes on the freeway. Now, these turns could still have been avoided had the motorcade continued like so and not taken the freeway, but since the freeway was the more scenic and expedient route, it was the more attractive choice. All of that is to say, the success of the assassination was largely dependent upon the selection of the Trade Mart. It might therefore be tempting to cast suspicion upon the family, but it should be noted that he rode in the presidential limousine along with the Kennedys and suffered grave injuries during the shooting. Not only that, but Connolly was actually opposed to a motorcade and favored a more direct route from the airport to the Trade Mart, a brief trip that would have bypassed Dealey Plaza altogether.
Makes sense.
He was unfortunately overruled by Kennedy himself, who wanted to see and be seen by the people of Dallas. Okay, so all that was happening behind the scenes, but as far as the public was aware, there wasn't even going to be a motorcade. As late as November the 15th, the Dallas Morning News reported that a motorcade seemed unlikely. But the very next day, the parade was finally confirmed. While the precise route followed by maps and detailed descriptions was not officially disclosed until November the 19th, someone familiar with Dallas could have approximated the route a few days in advance. That is to say, the earliest point a member of the public could have deduced that Kennedy would be driven past the book depository was November the 16th, less than a week before the visit. There's a good chance that Oswald saw these articles because he'd been observed reading political columns in the very same newspapers. Furthermore, we know from other aspects of Oswald's life that he was politically inclined.
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
What is the difference between the two?
Well, there's a great deal of difference. Several American parties in several countries are based on Marxism, such as Ghana. Certain countries have characteristics of a socialist system, such as Great Britain with its socialized medicine. These, then, are the differences between an outright communist country and countries which adhere to leftist or Marxist principles.
Conversely, a lack of interest in politics is precisely why at least one of Oswald's colleagues remained oblivious to the motorcade. So while it's understandable for someone apolitical to be taken off guard...
Hold on, just a question. Isn't technically, when you go with that path, in practice, that line will be less blurry and more mixed than one separating to the other?
By a presidential visit, it makes far less sense for someone like Oswald.
No? Okay, gotcha.
On November 21st, the day before the assassination that you were describing, was there any discussion between you and your husband about President Kennedy's trip or proposed trip to Texas, Dallas, and the Fort Worth area?
I asked Lee whether he knew where the president would speak and told him that I would very much like to hear him and to see him. I asked him how this could be done, but he said he didn't know how to do that and didn't enlarge any further on the subject.
Had there ever
This
been...
was also somewhat unusual, his lack of desire to talk about that subject any further.
How did you think it was unusual? Could you explain that?
The fact that he didn't talk a lot about it. He merely said something as an answer and did not have any further comments.
Do you mean by that, usually he would discuss a matter of that kind and show considerable interest?
Yes, of course. He would have told me who would be there and where this would take place.
We'll never know what Oswald was thinking when he spoke with James Jarman shortly before the assassination.